Hey Milton, thanks for sending me your code. I'm going to take a look at it now. So basically what I've done is I've cloned your repository. I've got it here so we can take a look in my editor. And I've also got your GitHub page open. And I'm basically just going to go through the whole thing and mention things that stand out to me or, that just catch my eye. So the first thing that I notice here is that you have the PyCache folder committed into your repo. And when you look at that, you can see that it has all these temporary files that the Python interpreter generates when it runs your program. And they're actually, they're temporary and they can be regenerated. They're just a cache for the bytecode that the interpreter generates. So usually you don't want to put those into the repository. Now, I was actually surprised that they're in there because when I looked at your gitignore file, and I can bump up the font size a bit. When I looked at your gitignore file, I saw that you have the PyCache folder in there, and you also have a regex here or a pattern for the PyC files. So normally they, this should have just worked and shouldn't have included that folder. But probably what I would recommend is that we'll just delete that folder now because I'm suspecting that it was added before you updated the gitignore. So what I would probably do, well, first of all, I would create a new branch here. And then we're going to delete that folder. Okay, we need to do that recursively. All right, so we just got rid of that. And then I'm seeing an empty README here. Usually what I try to do is, have some basic information in my README files. So what I personally feel is super important is like, okay, how do I actually run this thing? Because here there are two files. I don't really know how to run this. I mean, one of them is called main script file. It's probably the one we want to take a look at, but it would really help if you could just drop, a quick line like, hey, this is the Scrapper program. It does the following things, and this is how you run it. If you have tests, this is how you run the tests. This is how, maybe before you even explain how to run it, you could explain how to install it, because I'm seeing a requirements.txt file here, so that probably means we need to install some of these dependencies. So I would just call that out. And another thing you may want to add is just license information. And I've got a longer blog post on that topic that I'm going to link in the description. But basically, what that blog post is about is, it's like a tutorial how to write a minimal GitHub README file. And I think this would really help you out, make this more awesome. So be sure to check in the description later. All right, cool. So the next thing I'm seeing here. So what I want to mention about the gitignore, I think it's really good that you have a gitignore in there, and it looks reasonable to me. So we just need to get rid of that PyCache folder. Looked at the README, and then now we have the main script file, writing data on CSV, Py, and requirements.txt. So the naming here is interesting, I think. On the one hand, I like that it's called main script file because, well, it really explains to you what the main script file is. On the other hand, maybe a better name would be to just name it the way to just give it the name of your program, right? If your program is called Scrapper, maybe you just want to call that scrapper.py. And I think it would be really obvious that it's the main file. I think that would be a more conventional naming structure, but, no big deal. I like explicit names, so I think this is kind of cute. Right, so with these two, so I took a quick look earlier, and it looks like they're not really being... So it looks like they're two separate programs, right? Or this is like a test where you have this, or not a test, but like some experiment where you were writing that write on CSV method. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to ignore this file and just focus on main script file. And we're going to do that in not in GitHub, but we're going to do that in Sublime Text, which is my favorite editor. So, all right, let's pull that up. I've already bumped up the font size a bit. I think we can get rid of the terminal now. Okay, so let's make this a little bit larger still so you can see that well. Okay, so a couple of things that I'm noticing immediately because I'm running a linter sort of embedded in my Sublime Text setup. So a linter is like a little tool that checks your code, and it's going to call out stuff that goes against common best practices or goes against formatting standards. And it also catches stuff that are just, plain errors like a syntax error. And I'm using the Sublime Linter plugin with Sublime Linter Flake 8. And I find this super, super helpful whenever, I'm writing Python code, because it's basically, it's going to really help you avoid some of the things that I'm seeing in your code here. Before we dive into that, I want to say it's pretty cool that you're actually structuring this stuff into separate functions. What I'm seeing a lot of times is where people, they just want to write a simple script, quote unquote. And I've done that myself, right? Where you start implementing, hacking away on a simple script, and then 3-4 hours later, or like a week later, it's actually like this super complicated thing that doesn't have a lot of structure to it. So I'm really enjoying the fact that you actually have some structure here, and you split this up into separate functions, which is cool. So right, okay. So what I said, you can see there's a lot of yellow here, and that is stuff that the linter is calling out. And let's just go through that really quickly. So the first thing I'm noticing here is that your naming is a little bit inconsistent. So here, your functions, they use these the snake case layout, and then here that function is almost named like a class. I think it's a bit odd, so I would probably just rename that and call it generate HTML. Space missing. You don't really need those lines here. I think they make it harder to read what's going on. So like typically, what the Python style guide would recommend is just, to get rid of these lines. And we can do that here everywhere. Okay, cool. And then, we had this inconsistent spacing between functions. All of this stuff, if it happens a couple of times, it's not that horrible. But I think what it's really good to clean that up and make it consistent, because then your brain doesn't have to focus on that. I always like to think of a programmer's brain almost like working almost like a compiler, right? Because if I want to understand what your code does, I need to do the same things that a compiler would do, right? I need to parse it. I need to understand sort of the structure of the program. And then I also need to kind of build up this mental model in my head of what the program actually does. And if you have like things like inconsistent spacing, I think it makes it a lot harder to get a good feeling of how the program is structured quickly. So I am really a stickler for using, formatting best practices or some kind of style guide. And now that we have these tools, it's actually really easy to stick to a style guide. So in your case, what are in the case of looking at your code, what I would do is like just make that a little bit more regular, right? So we've figured out the spacing here, and now just a minor thing. So this is using tabs, and it's so that would look okay, right? Because using one tab indentation here, but then here we're using two tabs to indent the code, and that just becomes a little bit odd. So what I'm going to do here with this whole block, I'm just going to move that over to the left, and then I'm going to actually convert that to spaces. Because that's usually the recommendation that the Python PEP 8 style guide gives. All right, so that looks a little bit cleaner. What I like to do with the imports here as well, and this is something that I do. I don't think this is in the PEP 8 style guide, for example. So what I like to do is I like to split these up into imports that are part of the Python standard library. Like the CSV module and the OS module, and then third-party imports, because that really helps me understand, what does this code actually rely on? Like which external libraries do I need to run that? And then another thing that I'm seeing already is that, okay, so this includes requests and Beautiful Soup. And in our requirements, there's a lot of other stuff. So it might be possible that this is actually getting pulled in by Beautiful Soup, but I don't think so. So there's a lot of stuff, in your requirements.txt that doesn't actually relate to what your program needs. And I would really recommend that you try to keep the requirements.txt as minimal as possible. So in this case, you might actually be able to get away with just putting requests and Beautiful Soup, and you would kind of get the same result. Right? Okay. All right, so back to the formatting to get that out of the way. There are a couple of things that just catch my eye here, and this is the inconsistent formatting again with how you're spacing out your arguments here. And all of this stuff, it's not bad. Like, this is just part of learning how to write Python, I think, where in the beginning you don't notice that stuff, right? Because your brain isn't used to. But like, this stuff just really jumps out at me, and it makes it a lot harder to actually read the code and understand what's going on. So I'm gonna change the formatting on those. Yeah. So what I probably would do here is, because print is just a function in Python 3, and you mentioned this is Python 3 code, I would just format that like any other function call. And in here, the extra parentheses, they don't actually do anything, so we can get rid of those as well. So this looks pretty clean now. Parsing and scrape data. Okay, so another thing that I'm noticing here is that, see how the naming all of a sudden is different? So we had generate HTML and write on CSV. And now here, it's parsing and scrape data. So I would probably just change that to a more like active verb and just say parse and scrape data, and we pass it the raw data. And again, here, it would space out the arguments. Okay, so this is gonna make me sound like a horrible person, but I really like having consistent quotes for strings, because again, I find it a little bit confusing to see, how we have these strings highlighted here, and they're using single quotes, and then we get the double quotes here. So I would try and make all of those consistent. I know in this case you probably did it because you're, if you're using the double quotes, you can just use a single quote, and I think that's fine. You just got to make a decision what kind of quotes you want to use. So in this case, why don't we use the double quotes everywhere? And then again, the structure becomes a lot more regular, and I can just parse that out mentally a lot easier, because it's all the same color in my syntax highlighting. And it's just easier for me to understand what the code does and to mentally parse it out. So again, we can get rid of these parentheses. And then here, so you're doing this thing where your assignments, they're not formatted consistently. And that stuff also, I would just try and make it consistent, right? Because if that's something you can pick up and just train yourself to do consistently, I think it's going to have a huge impact on just the cleanliness on of your code, and it's just going to make it a lot easier for other people to read, right? So we're gonna format that differently. And with all of the stuff that I'm mentioning, it's actually being called out by the linter, right? So when I select that piece and you look here, I'm not sure if you can read that in the video, but it actually says missing white space around operator. So this is something that a linter can catch. So if you just install a linter in your editing environment, or even if you just run it from the command line, so you can actually do that really easily. Just doing a pip install flake 8. And then even if you don't want to go through integrating flake 8 into your editing environment, you can just run that from the command line, right? And it's going to call out the same kinds of errors and style guide violations. So I find this super helpful, because it's really going to help you train avoiding these kinds of formatting errors. And it's also going to, I don't think it's going to mention these extra parentheses, but it's just going to make it a lot easier for you to avoid these formatting inconsistencies. It's probably a typo here. Yeah, I think that's okay. You're on XYZ URL. Okay, cool. All right, let's take a look at write on CSV, and then again, what I'm going to do here is just make all of the string quotes consistent. Wait, what did I do here? Okay, yeah, just needed an extra quote here. Okay, again, there's a missing space. And then I would dent that a bit differently. Okay. Oh yeah, error white space before. Just want to open that file. Okay. So now this actually lints cleanly, right? There are no linter errors being called out here, which I think this is good. You know, this is the kind of code you should be committing, I think, because then, you know, it's really consistent and all of your files are going to sort of look the same. And then you can really focus on the actual structure of the code or the actual problem that that code solves. Okay, so let's take a look at that. What makes this a little bit challenging here is that I don't really know how to run this, right? So this is main script file. It kind of looks like a module that exports a bunch or defines a bunch of functions, but I don't really know how they're working together. So I'm assuming you probably run this from the interpreter somehow and make it work together, and that's totally fine, right? It's actually, I think it's the right thing what you're doing here, where you're just throwing that into a module and then you can import that and work with the interpreter directly. But for me, it's really hard to actually understand how these pieces work together. So again, what would really help there is updating the README, you know, just putting there how to actually run this. And then what you can do, if you have a main script file, what you could do is you would typically define or have like a top level if statement that checks if someone is running that script file directly from the command line with the Python interpreter. Let me just type that out. Right? See, I'm already starting to use inconsistent quotes because I usually use single quotes, but whatever. I just like them to be consistent. Okay, so now what happens is when you run this script, oh, okay. So this is interesting. Now that this is another thing, right? So now that we actually try to run this, we don't have requests installed. And I did actually install the requirements, but it looks like your requirements doesn't actually have, oh, hold on. Okay, my bad. It's just my bad. I apparently forgot to install. Oh, okay. It didn't go through, right? So the problem here is that the requirements don't install cleanly. I should have checked the error message. So this MySQL connector can't be installed. So it looks like right now what you have in your requirements.txt, at least on my machine, I'm not able to install that. So something that could help you with that, and that's maybe stuff for a little bit further down the road, is just having some kind of automated build setup that whenever you make a commit in GitHub, it just tries and install all the requirements and run your code from scratch on a new machine. And there are free services you can use. You can use Travis CI for that, for example, which is a great service that I would recommend. It's actually free for open source or public repos on GitHub. And then you're going to catch immediately, you know, if something like that happens where it's probably not your fault even. It's just the fact that there was a new release of MySQL connector or some other dependency and they don't play together well. And you're going to be able to catch that if you have automated builds for that. But you know, again, maybe that's something you want to look into in the future. All right, so back to what I wanted to show you in the first place. I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but I still hope it's going to be helpful when you watch the video in the end. So what I wanted to show you is that, right, okay, we need beautiful soup as well. More dependencies. So we just want to install beautiful soup 4. Okay. All right, so now when I run this, like so, Python main script file.py, then what happens is if you run a script like that, or if you run a script like this through this method, Python sets that underscore or that dunder name variable to dunder main. So you can use this as a check to see if someone runs your script like a program. Because if I do import main script file, it doesn't execute that line, right? Because we're not running it like a program. So this is super useful in the situation that we're in right now, where you want to use a module like that just to work with it from the Python interpreter, which I imagine is what you're trying to do. But you also want to provide kind of, a way to run this as a standalone program. So you can use something like this to do that, and then you would kind of do something useful with this, right? You'd probably call like fetch the HTML first and then parse it and scrape it, right? So you could put that stuff here, and then you kind of get the best of both worlds. But yeah, that's just a tip, and you could look into that in the future. Okay, so I'm seeing a bunch of print statements. I think that's fine. In the future, you may want to look into the logging module, but I think would probably be overkill for what you're doing at the moment. So I think that's totally fine. All right, so this fetches this thing here. I kind of like what you're doing here, where you're giving this a name, right? Because r.content, it's kind of hard to know what that is. And as you're giving it a name, then we know that you're returning the HTML for that URL. I would probably still shorten that because it's kind of in the name. So I would probably just do return our content, and then you could put a doc string here and that says, fetch a base URL, fetch base URL and return the HTML content, or something like that, right? And then I'm not sure if you want to call that generate HTML, maybe fetch HTML, because you're actually doing an HTTP request to fetch that. I'm not sure if you want to call that base URL, because usually what I would think a base URL is, is some kind of part of a URL that then becomes the full URL when you tack something on at the end, almost like a prefix. So maybe just call that URL. I would probably rename it and just call it URL. I think would be fine. Okay. Now, okay, I don't think we were using the generate HTML part before. Okay, so we don't need to rename that anywhere else. Okay, so and then I think the way this works is, we would enter here, and then this would use write on CSV somewhere here, right? Okay, parse and scrape data. I really like the name. I think it's pretty cool because, well, actually, what's the difference between parsing and scraping? Yeah, we parse it out and then figure out the parts that we actually need. So, one could argue here that it would make more sense to split this up into two functions, where like one is, okay, we're going to parse it, and then another function would actually pull out the interesting bits. So again, it's not a super long function, which I think is fine, but if you want it to be super clean, you could think about splitting it up. Okay, so let's look at this. Right, so this just creates a parser. We're just iterating over that. So I think it would be fair to actually get rid of that local variable and just to say for items in soup find all, because I'm not sure if this is actually, a name like G data, which I'm assuming is something like global data or something. It doesn't really give me a lot in terms of understanding. So I would probably get rid of it just to not confuse readers, but could go either way. That's probably what I would do. Okay, so we're creating a new dictionary here. And then yeah, so with this stuff, I think it would actually be fair to just do this inline, right? Instead of saying a tag, I think it would be fair to just do this. Because otherwise, my brain has to keep track of a couple more variables. And here, maybe this thing should also be called just item, because it looks like we're actually looking at one item. would make more sense to me. But, like the naming stuff is usually really hard because I don't have a lot of, or, when I'm looking at this and just kind of renaming things here in your code, then for me, it's really hard to know what the background story is there and what this actually does. Like, I'm assuming you have some kind of specific website in mind that would be, that we're scraping here. So, but yeah, I think this would be fair, to have this dotted axis go 2 levels deep. I think this would be totally okay. Print link. All right, okay, this is the link. Yeah, it's just like a debugging statement. Yeah, if you want to keep that, I think it's okay. Product details. All right, and then we're setting this up. So again, here, what I would probably do, because we're creating this structure here, and then we're not really doing much with it. So I think it would be fair to say, to do this actually. Wait. I think it would be fair to do this. Oops. Where we're not creating the dictionary ahead of time, but we're just creating it with a dictionary expression, right? Like this. And then I think it becomes clearer what's going on here, because otherwise I'd have to remember, okay, we're creating an empty dictionary up here, then we're not doing anything with it, and then at the end we just kind of populate it. So I would probably do it like this, and then what you can do here is you can always end those lines with a comma, because that Python allows you to do that, and you don't have to remember adding an extra comma when you add a new line at some point. So it's something I like to do in my code, but it's like super tiny, unimportant tidbit. Anyway. Okay, so we're doing this. We're passing this through to write on CSV, and I just want to make sure I'm running Flake 8 cleanly still. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at write on CSV. So we're passing. So again, we're using the name data here for this thing. And we're using that in a bunch of places, right? Remember how this guy takes raw data, and then we also had g_data. So I think what's interesting here is that we actually pass the product details to write on CSV. I would probably just say, instead of calling this thing data, we just call it product details, right? And then here, probably, I don't know what this really takes, but I imagine this would actually take the HTML, right? So instead of calling this raw data, you could think about calling that page HTML or something like that. But let's leave it like that for now, because I don't actually know what goes into it. Okay, so with this part, file exists equals OS path is file. And so is file tests whether a path is a regular file, which kind of goes contrary to what this thing says here. We're saying file exists. So there is also an exists function in os.path that tests whether a given path exists, which sounds like that's... So what, okay, wait, what's this doing? Oh, okay, I guess we're checking if we need to append the header, right? Yeah, let's think about that for a second here. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I would think about what would probably, because so what can actually happen here is that you can have a race condition, right? Where you're checking if the file exists, but what could actually happen is that your program here is preempted for another process or thread to run. And then that other process is going to delete Google results.csv. And so you're assuming it still exists, but then you're opening the file, and the file you actually get doesn't have that header in here. And you're not writing the header because you did that check earlier, you know? And this may sound like, oh, you know what, this would actually never happen in the real world, but you know, it might happen. Like if you imagine like later, maybe this code, you know, becomes bigger and bigger, and eventually you want to run like 100 or 1,000 scrapers at the same time. And then you're gonna get into these situations where this kind of stuff is really gonna lead to some really, really tough to debug problems. And believe me, I've been there. So that's why I'm mentioning it. So I think we would have to think about doing this a little bit differently. And at top of my head, I don't really know the best way to go about it. I mean, it's probably fine for a small program like that for the moment, but just, as a heads up, it's potentially something you want to look into. I'm thinking maybe it would be better to just, see how large the file is if it's completely empty. And there might be another way to do it. I don't really know what the best way would be to go about it, but I'm pretty sure that this could lead you into trouble in the future. So maybe just something to keep in mind. And also, I'm not sure if you want isFile or if you want dot exists. And then also, we were using this string here a couple of times. So this is actually something I would just pass in here and maybe give it a default, right? Because then you get the same result, but you don't have the danger of accidentally having a typo in the second line here. And then this would, the file exists check would look at another file, a completely different file potentially than here, the context manager, when you open that file. So again, this, makes it a little bit easier to avoid that kind of inconsistency. Alternatively, we could have made that a constant as well, but I think seeing that this is a function, I think it's fair to pass that in here. Okay, so we're opening that CSV file. We have the field names here. I think that's fair. I potentially could also do that inline. I would probably do that inline, and I would have constants for these guys, right? So you could say, you could do something like that. And then everywhere we're using title, I would do this. And then with Python 3, you could potentially do oh wait, this is actually something else. So I don't know what how dictwriter really works, but oh, okay. See, this is a little bit more okay. So let's actually do this a little bit differently. Okay, so this key here is called links, and then we pass link in here, which is a little bit odd. So I would probably rename that as well, just to make sure it's consistent. And then I would, like I said earlier, I would say field title. I would do this. Give it a name here. And then I would also do this. And then here, so this is a list, which means it's mutable. Probably want this to be a tuple. And I think dictwriter can deal with a tuple in this case. So I would probably do something like this. And just change the formatting slightly. I think that would be fair. Or depending on how you want your formatting to go, could also do it like this. There's different ways to do that. Yeah, maybe that looks pretty. As long as it's consistent, doesn't really matter. Okay, so I think that's a little bit clearer, because now what can't happen is that we use inconsistent naming for these guys, right? Because otherwise it would be really easy to actually say, whoops, it would be really easy to actually say, okay, this is the titles field, and then we're using a different key here than we'd be using down there. So it really helps to make that consistent. And you could look into making that a Python 3 enum as well. But I think doing it like that would probably be fine. You could think about instead of making this a dictionary, you could think about making this a named tuple, which would give you a little bit more naming guarantee. So I basically define like a product details named tuple up here, and then you could use it in all those places, and you would have a little bit more security in terms of, how your data structures, what they look like, instead of passing around a dictionary. But I think, even doing it like this is a little bit better, because then you have a better chance of using the same names for keys and stuff. So I would probably do it like that. Okay, again, like the file exists check here. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. And then we're writing out that one row, and we're printing something out here. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? So all in all, a ton of changes, but it wasn't meant in mean spirit. I think, your program probably worked before. I couldn't really test it out, but I hope you learned something from that quick code review, and just kind of me going through this and like restructuring everything, or it was mostly formatting stuff. But I think, again, you were on the right track. And yeah, I like the fact that you had sort of a basic structure in here. I really like sort of the data flow through the whole program. That was really good. And my number one recommendation for you in terms of how can you get to the next level as a Python programmer, look into tools like Flate 8. I think it's going to have a huge impact. It certainly had a huge impact on my ability to write code and to write clean code and to work better with other developers and work better on open source projects. Because, if all of that formatting discussion is out of the way, then it just becomes a lot easier to scale your programs, make them bigger and bigger, and work with other people. So really, really look into that. I think that's probably the number one thing. I think this would really help you become better as a Python developer. And it would, just by the fact that would free up a lot of mental capacity, because your brain doesn't have to parse out all of that inconsistent formatting. You're going to have a lot more brain cycles available in your brain Python compiler to actually focus on the important stuff. And yeah, best of luck. I hope this was useful. And I'm going to just create a pull request for that, and then you can take a look at that, or pick up some things that you find helpful or not. Cool. All right. Thanks, Milton, and have a super fantastic day. See ya.